Thank you so much for joining us again at Hillside Community Church. Here's the outline for today's lesson. If you want to take a minute and kind of write those down, we will go ahead and fill those in as we go along. Now, I know I've said this before, but I don't think I say it nearly enough. I am blessed to work with a team of pastors. So many of the pastors that I meet with and talk with throughout the weeks and around town, they're kind of on their own. Most of them don't have any help, and in fact, not even a part-time person, maybe with the exception of a secretary. But I, on the other hand, I've got all kinds of people that I work with. Our lead pastor here is Ashley Shook. He is the lead pastor and handles the Bellwood campus. John Poe, right here, he is the youth guy at the Bellwood campus, but he also does a lot of the associate pastor work as well. Nathaniel Gray is the newest member of our team. He's actually the pastor at the Juniata campus. And I now have Paul and his wife helping out on a part-time basis at the Tyrone campus. They've been a great asset, to say the least. Now, Ashley is always available. He's always approachable, and he's pretty smart. So, looks can be deceiving. Nate is the new guy. Like I said, he's full of excitement, new ideas, always eager to learn. And Paul is my detail guy. He has a skill set that not only births new ideas, but he's also gifted in forward thinking and planning. But John Poe, he does a lot. He does a lot of things that make us all better. And obviously, in most cases, more productive. Now, he's a high detail guy. And specifically for me, he's my go-to guy for tech questions. I cannot tell you how many times over the past 12 years he has helped me fix my phone or fix my computer. Recently, my email got hacked, and he helped me figure out not only how it happened, but what they had done and trying to gather my information. And he helped me to fix it. I remember one time when my screen just froze. He fixed it. My phone wouldn't close a certain program. He got it to work. In the office, I don't know how many times this has happened. We'll be working, and his office is right next door to mine, and I'll say, John, are you online? And he'll say, yeah. I'm like, because I've got nothing. And so we'd figure it out. 95% of the time, though, he was able to fix the issues by simply rebooting the device. He looked like a genius, but in actuality, all he was doing was turning it off and turning it back on. That's called a reboot. Now, reboot means to start something anew, to refresh something by making it a new start or creating a new version. And by working with John, I have learned that many of my technological issues can be resolved by simply rebooting the device. Laptop went black, reboot. Phone's not working properly, reboot. The internet stopped working. Just find the router and, you guessed it, reboot. Now, you may not realize this, but there's actually a reboot in the Bible. That's right. Now, God didn't call it a reboot, but that's what happened in Genesis chapter 6. Things in the world had gotten so bad that God decided to reboot his creation. And he did this with an ark and a guy named Noah. Now, according to the Bible Society website, Noah and the ark is the most famous story in the Old Testament. You know, and I believe that. I mean, I remember as a child reading the story or having the story read to me. I remember the coloring pages about the ark and the animals with the little dove with a branch in its beak. I even today, when I see a rainbow, my mind goes back to Noah and the great flood. And I'm sure yours does too. But the story of Noah really isn't a very kid-friendly story. Now, it's a story about a global flood that God sent to kill every living thing. Now, unfortunately for most people, the story of Noah and the ark rarely goes beyond the animals. For many, it's just a story. In fact, some of them say it's a fairy tale, a good tale with helpful principles. But this thing happened, and it's real. And here's something else that they miss. The events of Genesis 6 and 7, they're not about the animals. It's not even about Noah. No, the focus is all about God. In the end, we're not supposed to be impressed with Noah. It's all about God. So what is this this famous event found in Genesis 6? What is it that teaches us about God? What's our sticky statement for today's lesson? Judgment and grace of God are never flawed. That's right. The judgment and grace of God is never flawed. They're not. That's our sticky statement. It should be the first thing you saw in your notes. And we're going to see today this truth was evident from the start. That's the title of our current series. We are in week 5 of a 6-week series. In this series, in Genesis, we have learned that what we believe about the beginning will impact how we understand the universe and how we are a part of that universe, where we fit in. How the unfolding of creation shapes everything about history, our faith, our redemption, God's Word, and God Himself. Now, if you've missed any of those, obviously you can go to the YouTube channel and catch up on some of them. I encourage you to do that. Last week we saw how the legacy that you will leave is determined by the life you now lead. That legacy can influence and shape future generations. As we closed the service last week, we saw how this was true in the life of Enoch. He walked with God, and that set a powerful example for his children and his grandchildren, one of whom was Noah. The account of Noah and the ark brings up many questions for people. There's theological questions. How could a good God destroy all of civilization with a flood? Maybe a scientific question. Was the whole earth flooded, or was it just a localization? There's logistical questions. How did all the animals fit on the ark? We'll talk about that before we end today. How did Noah get those animals on the ark? Well, there's also practical questions. How many trees did it take to build the ark? Where did that tar or that pitch come from that they actually sealed up the outside of the ark? And I have a personal question. Why in the world did God allow Noah to take those 2 cats on the ark? And I thought the whole purpose of the flood was to eliminate the evil from the world. Keeping cats around, that seems a little counterproductive. I jest. Our text today is Genesis chapter 6. We're going to start in verse 5 and roll all the way through. I believe we're going to end up on verse 24 of chapter 7. So as you turn to that passage, as you pull it up on your phone, let me catch you up to speed. God had a plan. What He had created in Genesis 1 and 2 was perfect. But in chapter 3, as we saw a couple of weeks ago, sin was introduced into the world. And what was initially in perfect order, it's now in complete disorder. So God needed to reboot or reset creation. That's the reason for the flood. That's our first point, the reason for the flood. Look with me at verse 5 and following of chapter 6. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. There's 3 words there. Every, only, all. We're going to talk about those in just a second. The Lord regretted that He had made human beings on the earth, and the earth was deeply troubled. Verse 7. So the Lord said, I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race that I've created, and with them the animals, the birds, and the creatures that move along the ground. For I regret that I have made them. So leading up to Noah's story, God's children, the people on the earth, were in absolute chaos. We know that Cain killed his brother Abel. Later on, Jacob deceives his father and steals a birthright from Esau. Esau is trying to kill him. Finally, there's Lamech. We heard about him last week. A cruel and angry man who just kills for the fun of it. Sin is everywhere and has affected almost everyone. So notice the words used in this verse. Every, only, and all. Those 3 words leave absolutely nothing out. So the message is clear. The perfect world God created had been destroyed by the sinful acts of humanity. And finally, God says, enough! But He probably didn't use that tone. You see, it wasn't so much anger. Now, the heart of God is stricken with grief and disappointment. Walter Bergman, an Old Testament scholar, says it this way. God is not angered but grieved in this verse. He's not enraged but saddened. The depth of God's pain is revealed in the use of the Hebrew word here, which is the same word used to describe the pain of childbirth. This is the depth and magnitude of God's pain over what he sees and the decision he has to make. Now, there are some who, when they read of God's plan to destroy every living thing, they say, that doesn't sound very loving. I mean, how could a loving God destroy all of humanity? Has that thought ever crossed your mind? Let me tell you why. It's because you have a lopsided view of God. You see, that's why you struggle with the judgment side of God. Our tendency is to focus on and desire the love of God, and rightfully so. I mean, after all, in 1 John 4:8, it says that God is love. However, God's number one attribute is not love. It's his holiness. God's holiness pervades everything, and it shapes all his attributes. Follow me here. His love is a holy love. His mercy is a holy mercy. And even his anger and wrath are holy anger and holy wrath. And see, that's why the judgment and grace of God are never flawed. So in our first point, we see God's judgment. It was the reason for the flood. Now we're going to look at his grace. We see that in our second point, the refuge in the flood. Just as God was all in exercising, or executing, I guess, judgment, he's also all in demonstrating his grace. Look at verse 8. He said, but Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Now I want you to notice that Noah found favor. He didn't earn it. It was all God. Genesis 6:9 says that Noah was a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time, and he walked faithfully with God. So why did Noah find favor with God? Well, there's three things listed there. First, he was righteous. In other words, Noah believed in God, he trusted in God, and he lived as God intended, regardless of what was going on around him. The second thing we see here about Noah is that he was blameless. Now, that doesn't mean that he's perfect, but rather he was one who lives out the commands of the faith and is pleasing to God. And then finally, Noah is described as one who walks with God. That's a powerful image, but what does it mean? Well, my first image, the image that comes to my mind, is that of Adam and Eve before they sinned, how they walked in the cool of the day in the garden with God, their creator. That was awesome. You see, it speaks of physical, it speaks of emotional, it speaks of spiritual closeness to God. Who doesn't want that? Paul puts it this way in Ephesians 4:1. He says, therefore I, the prisoner of the Lord, implore you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which you have been called. The description of Noah's rightness with God is all-encompassing. It touches every aspect of his life. That's how it needs to be with us today. See, all of life is an opportunity to worship God. We do it through our words, through our actions. Every moment, every decision, every circumstance is an opportunity to intentionally do the will of God. And that doesn't happen by accident. No, it's intentional. It's an intentional effort of being connected to God, led by him and by his word. It's not having God be a part of your life. It's God being your whole life. You see, he touches every fiber of your being. It's the foundation on which you stand. Noah lived a deeply faithful, deeply obedient life with God. And now, through an incredible demonstration of his grace, God was going to reboot creation through Noah. In verses 14 through 17, we read the mentions of the ark. Now, I'm not going to get into all those things today, but In today's comparison, the ark had the capacity of 500 railroad cars. That's a big boat. And then in verses 18 through 22, God makes a covenant. Covenant is a divine promise which requires a relationship of commitment between God and some people. This covenant or promise that God made with Noah was a promise of refuge in the flood. It was salvation from God's judgment. Now, interestingly, this covenant was not just with Noah. No, it was with every creature that was on the ark. Which brings into question, how did all those animals fit on the ark? Well, here's a few questions. Here's a few thoughts. It might help you figure that out. Maybe give you some peace. First, there was only kinds represented, not breeds. For example, in the case of dogs, just 2 dogs were on the ark. It wasn't 2 of every breed of dog. Second, you may not know this, but there are only about 1,300 kinds of animals. Yeah. And of those 1,300, only about 180, 190 weigh more than 22 pounds. 200 of them are between the size of a sheep and a rat. And over 900 are less than the size of a rat. So the average size of an animal on the ark was probably the size of a, dare I say it, a cat. Again, can't get away from it. Last thought on the animals. The animals on the ark were probably not full-sized adult animals. And this makes perfect sense if you think about it. Younger animals would need less room. They wouldn't eat as much, and they'd be easier to manage. And they would have more time to reproduce after the flood. So I hope that helps you feel a little more comfortable about the whole animals on board question. So let's get back to the refuge promise in verses 11 through 16. There we see that Noah did all that God commanded him to do. And in verse 16 it says, "Then the Lord shut him in." God shut them in the ark away from his judgment. See, this is exactly how God does it every time. God's refuge in judgment is always found the exact same way. It's by grace, his grace, through our faith. God's grace and Noah's faith is what provided the refuge in the flood. In Hebrews 11:7, we read that by faith, Noah, when warned about things not yet seen, in holy fear built an ark to save his family. And by his faith, he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness that is in keeping with faith. See, those words again prove that the judgment and grace of God are never flawed. In the following 7 verses, we see our next point. It's the result of the flood. In verse 17, we read, "For 40 days the flood kept coming on the earth." Verse 20, "The waters rose and covered the mountains to a depth of more than 15 cubits. You're wondering, that's about 23 feet. Verse 21, "Every living thing that moved on land perished." So let's look at what happened as the result of the flood. Verse 21, it says that every living thing that moved on the earth died. Verse 22, everything on dry land that had the breath of life in his nostrils, died. Everything, in verse 23, on the face of the earth was wiped out. However, in the last half of verse 23, it says this, "Only Noah was left, and those with him on the ark." In these last 3 verses of Genesis 7, we clearly see that when it comes to our God, his judgment and grace are never flawed. So because this is true, what should we do? Noah and the ark is more than just a story. It is the description of actual events, and those events can serve us well today. When we read this narrative, it has to be with the perspective of time and further revelation from God. In other words, from the flood in Noah's time until now, a whole lot of time has passed, and a whole lot more of additional revelations from God are now known. So what I'm saying is that we should view the account through the lens of the New Testament. In fact, there are several passages in the New Testament that actually talk about this reboot, this flood. And it says that it should be a reminder of the reality of a future, final reboot. You know, Jesus speaks to this directly in Matthew 24. Let me turn here. I'm going to read this as we put it on the screen. Matthew 24, verse 37, it says this, "For the coming of the Son of Man will be just like the days of Noah. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark." And then verse 39, "And they did not understand until the flood came and took them all away. So will the coming of the Son of Man be." In that passage, Jesus gives us, I would say, more than just a heads up. You ever been on the receiving end of a heads up? Yeah, you walk maybe into your place of work at the beginning of your shift, and maybe you're passing somebody on their way out, and they say, "Hey man, just a heads up, the boss isn't in a good mood today." That kind of sets the mood for the entire rest of the day. You spend the whole shift trying to get all of your ducks in a row, make sure that your work is done well, but never really knowing what the boss is going to do. Well, Jesus isn't like that. He doesn't just let us know what's coming. No, he sets us up for success. And we see this in verse 42 of that same chapter, Matthew 24. Let me put it on the screen here. It says this, "Therefore be on the alert, for you do not know which day your Lord is coming." That's the application for today's sermon, given to us by Jesus himself. The takeaway from the first reboot, the flood, is the direction given to us for the final reboot, the judgment. And it's going to happen when Christ returns. We need to be alert. Jesus did not want his followers to be lulled into the world's shallow, short-term, temporal way of thinking. No, see, those temptations back then are as real and powerful for us today. You know, so many people live their lives based on the here and now. We focus on the temporal pleasures that are all around us, to the point that things like church and God, it's not only not a priority, it's not even a blip on our radar. And that's exactly where the people in Noah's day were. And they never saw the flood coming. They were evil all the day long. But you have to remember, Jesus, in the verses we just looked at in Matthew, he wasn't talking to the unsaved. No, he was talking to his followers. And we know this because of what we read in verse 3 of Matthew 24. It says this, "As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately and said, 'Tell us,' they said, 'when will this happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age?'" You see, Jesus wasn't afraid they were going to, like in Noah's day, miss the boat. No pun intended. No, his concern was that they would be lulled to sleep, spiritually speaking. And as he spoke to his followers then, he is speaking to us today, right now. See, our world is flooded with spiritual distractions and spiritual tranquilizers. Let me explain. When it comes to spiritual distractions, these are things that they're maybe not bad in and of themselves, but they draw us away from the very things that help us maintain our alertness. And then there's the spiritual tranquilizers. These are things that we do that falsely lead us to believe that we're all good with God. Things like maybe we do an okay job of practicing some personal spiritual disciplines. Maybe we show up for church somewhat regularly. Maybe we catch a short devotional every now and then. Maybe we serve once or twice a year in a big event at the church. We might even pray when things get really, really bad. But our heart isn't in it. There's no real risk to our level of commitment to Jesus. We just kind of going through the motions. Unlike Noah, who was righteous, he was blameless and walked with God, spiritually today, we are barely awake, let alone alert. Now, while we're all prone to become lackadaisical and spiritual, lethargic, I get that. When it's left unchecked, what happens is we lose sight of the ultimate, all-important realities of eternity. Just like the people in Noah's time, and they actually had a real-time disconnect from this impending judgment of God, Christ's followers in Matthew 24 were in danger of living as if judgment wasn't going to come. And many Christians today, in the same way, are living as if that final reboot isn't going to come. And that's why Jesus instructed them, and he's telling us, be alert. Now here's 3 ways that you and I can remain alert. Number 1, you need to pay attention. Pay attention to what you pay attention. You see, as Christians, we got to be careful what has our attention. And what fills our minds ultimately fills our hearts. You see, what we give our attention to is most often what we do. Maybe it's your work. Maybe it's your investments, your hobbies. Maybe it's a relationship. You know how to tell? Look at your calendar. Look at your checkbook. You're going to see what has your attention. I guarantee you. Secondly, we need to create some boundaries. When it comes to guarding what's valuable in our lives, we set up boundaries to make sure that those things are protected. And we do this all the time with things like our vehicles, our home, our kids. We even do it with our pets. Yeah. When you walk your dog, do you put them on a leash? Why? It's because you don't trust that they won't get distracted by a rabbit or a squirrel and take off. You see, the leash is the boundary. Well, in the same way, we need to set up boundaries in our lives to protect ourselves from distractions. And again, there are some distractions that are not bad in and of themselves. Let me give you a personal example. Last year, I was a crossing guard at the high school. And while I enjoyed doing it and I got to meet new people, and which paved the way for me to kind of invite them to church, I found out that it was pulling too much time from my week. I wasn't able to do that and still meet the standard required of me to do what I was called to do. So I had to let it go. I needed that boundary. So what are some boundaries in your life? Is it screen time limits, maybe on your phone? Maybe it's working the hours that you do. Maybe you need to limit those. Maybe you need to say no to overtime. Maybe you need to say no to that second job. Maybe there's some activity time limits that need to be put in place. Maybe you stop putting yourself in risky situations, places where you know nothing good is going to come out of it. Look, you know where you need to set some boundaries. But there's one more. This is the biggest challenge because it's the most important. This is the one that you will need to really work hard at because everything in this world fights you on it. And it's this. You need to set your mind above. Paul tells us in Colossians 3:2, he says, set your mind on the things above, not on the things of this earth. So the way we stay alert is to become focused on the things of heaven. A Greek word for the word set, it emphasizes that it's an ongoing decision. So Christians must continually discipline themselves to focus on the eternal realities instead of the temporal realities of this world. So, right now, if you find yourself more driven to achieve the American dream, the pursuit of happiness here on earth, than you do the spiritual things that await us in heaven, I got to tell you, friend, you are going to be disappointed. You see, when we set our minds on the things above, we're going to see Jesus more. We're going to see him as more important, more interesting, more captivating than anything else in our life. And as a result, everything else will be put in its right perspective. So what has your attention? Where do you need to set boundaries? And where is your mind focused? The judgment of God, the grace of God are real, and they were powerfully displayed by God in the flood. And the day is coming when we will see them again in the final reboot. Our response should not be one out of fear, but out of godliness. Yes, the judgment and grace of God is never flawed. So we need to be alert. I hope you are. Let me pray for you as we close. Heavenly Father, I thank you for this incredible heads up that you've given us. You stepped into our world and told us this is what's going to happen. And then you even referred back to Noah's day and said, just like that, it's going to happen again. Heavenly Father, my prayer is that for me and my church family and all those listening to this video, that we would take a look to see where we're at. Are we spiritually alert? Are we focused on the things above? Do we have boundaries set in place? Are we aware of what's drawing our attention? I pray your Holy Spirit works in our lives and identifies those things, and that we then address them appropriately. Thank you again for your incredible love, the refuge you provide for us every day, and what you already have set up for us when this final judgment comes. Thank you again. In your precious name, amen. Thanks so much for watching. I pray you have a great week. God bless.